Welcome back to the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy and I love both travel and history. Today we're going to do a flyover of Berlin's Museum Island. The island houses 5 world-class museums, a rebuilt former royal palace, and more art and statuary than you could shake a stick at. It would take more than one day or one visit to see it properly. In fact, I'm not sure it could be seen properly in just a week. Berlin was finally reunited in 1990 into a single city and is the capital of the Federal Republic of Germany. Despite years of neglect in the eastern sector, which was captured by the Soviet Red Army at the end of World War II and then turned over to its puppet state, the German Democratic Republic, a great deal of rehabilitation is now happening. Rehabilitation only happens to something that once existed. The Museum Island was purpose-built over the course of more than a century by the monarchs of Germany, who were intent on displaying their art, power, taste, and wealth. Even an armchair traveler is going to have to pick and choose unless you move there, so choosing requires deciding what interests you most. Let's take a look at what is available today on the Armchair Traveler. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word-heavy, heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen and in the description box below. This island was once the home and playground of the monarchy, but before that it was actually a swamp facing the Berlin City Palace. Berlin City Palace sat on the southern half of the island. It was the home of the Hohenzollern clan until the end of the monarchy at the end of World War I. Construction on the palace started in the 15th century, but the building was enlarged and updated several times, probably most notably by Frederick the Great and his architect André Schleuter. That building long predated the art museums on the northern half of the island. The builder constructed a sturdy edifice that managed to stand up to 2 Allied bomb runs at the end of World War II, although the dome and the roof took a couple of direct hits, which actually set the building on fire, but managed to leave the walls mostly intact. It could have been rebuilt, but the East Berlin and East German governments had their hands full at the end of the war, just trying to house and feed the population here inside of East Berlin. They ignored the building for as long as they could, and after that, the building didn't just die from neglect, they demolished it. The East Germans tore down what was left of the palace and built their own construction, which they called the Palace of the Republic in 1970. This was back in the time when they thought the German Democratic Republic would last forever. The one photo I found of it on the right shows a bold modern building with copper-tinted glass, which I have to say isn't completely awful. However, it didn't blend very well with any of the remaining nearby architecture, and in 1990, when the city was finally reunited, the city decided jointly to tear it down and rebuild the former city palace, now rechristened the Humboldt Forum. Lustgarten was once a swamp, then a private garden, then many more things, and now finally is the front lawn of the Altes Museum, shown in this photograph. The name means pleasure garden. The park has had plenty of makeovers. Originally, it became a kitchen garden for the Berlin City Palace, which we just visited. One story says that this was the first place in what is now Germany where potatoes were grown. By the 17th century, Frederick Wilhelm, the Great Elector, turned it into a pleasure garden. However, more and worse was on tap. It was dug up and filled in with sand to become a military parade ground. At the end of the 18th century, it was replanted as a park. After the Altes Museum was built, it was renovated again, this time to harmonize with the new architecture. In the 20th century, it became a space for political gatherings. The Nazis managed to shove nearly 1 million people into this spot to listen, enthusiastically and with wild cheers, to the ravings of Adolf Hitler. They liked the effect so much they leveled it and paved it over so they could put even more people in here for massed marches and rallies. By the end of the war, it was a bomb-cratered wasteland. The German Democratic Republic, the Soviet Union's client state, left the paving in place, but replanted the lime trees around the edge to make it look a little nicer. They even renamed the Marx Engels plots. As soon as the Berlin Wall fell, it was renamed Lustgarten. The garden proper has excellent views of the Altes Museum shown here and also of the Berliner Dome or Berlin Cathedral, but not much in the way of shade. Perhaps shade isn't necessary here most of the year. The Altes Museum was the brainchild of Carl Friedrich Schinkel, built on order of King Frederick William III between 1825 and 1830. Opinions in the empire varied on who owned what exactly, but they were beginning to change, at least among the educated upper middle class of Prussia. The art holdings, formerly available only to the king, his family, and a favored few cronies, had been acquired courteously, one way or another, of the public purse, and the public, or at least this tiny slice of it, thought they should be able to see the collections as well. Surprisingly, I think, the king agreed and had this building pitched up to make it possible. I already knew that Schinkel was more interested in Greek and Roman-style architecture than the Baroque styles already scattered in this part of Berlin. This view of the Altes Museum really does give the impression of a classical Greek or Roman temple. It was built to house the antiquities collection, so the style of the building and the contents harmonize and complement each other. Frederick William IV was actually responsible for building what's called the Old National Gallery. As Crown Prince, he enjoyed the reputation of being both intelligent and artistic, but he was a political conservative. He worked on finishing up his father's long-promised but never delivered constitution. He also made sure that it continued to vest almost all power in the ruling Prussian landed aristocracy. Frederick William was responsible for several of the museums here on the island, so it's appropriate that he be represented in the sculpture in front of this one, the Altes National Gallery. Currently, the gallery is home mostly to 19th century paintings and sculptures. The new museum houses the national collection of both Greek and Egyptian artwork. It was built between 1843 and 1855 on order of King Frederick William IV. The style incorporates both classical and Renaissance architecture in what has become called Prussian Arcadia. The highlight of the collection is most certainly the famous bust of Nefertiti. This lady has gotten around quite a bit, but now lives here in the museum. An archaeological team, led by Ludwig Borchardt, discovered the bust in 1912 in Thutmose's workshop in Amarna. Thutmose was the court sculptor of Nefertiti's husband, Akhenaten. I think the most intriguing thing about her may not be her personal story, which is remarkable, or even her apparent beauty, obvious from this portrait bust. It was the fact that she was portrayed looking like a real, recognizable woman and in 3 dimensions, unlike most of the flat wall paintings like the illustration shown on the left. She is also the subject of an intense argument between Egypt and Germany over Egyptian demands for her return home. The fighting began in 1924, almost as soon as word got back to Egypt that she was on public display in Berlin. The Egyptians did authorize export of the piece, but then said that they were misled about what the bust was before they let it out of the country. In reply, the Berlin Museum refers to an official protocol signed by the German excavator and the Egyptian Antiquities Service of the time about a painted plaster bust of a princess. The lines to see this bit of limestone are usually around the block, and I'm not certain how good a look an ordinary visitor could get, or whether you'd have the opportunity during a regular visit to even think about her. I think she can be seen far better and more serenely on the internet, so I would most likely give this museum a pass. The Pergamon Museum takes its name from the immense altar of Zeus from Pergamon, which is on display here. The museum was actually constructed as an overflow to the Bode Museum, which we'll see in a few minutes. That museum had originally been intended to display art and sculpture being excavated in and around Babylon, Uruk, Assur, Miletus, Priene, and ancient Egypt. But the objects from these sites could not properly be displayed within the existing museum system. Among other things, some of them, like the altar, were simply too big to fit. The altar of Zeus at Pergamon was built probably between 180 and 160 BC. Scholars think it was probably an altar in the Temple of Athena. The altar's relief friezes, visible here on the far left and far right sides, are considered masterpieces of Hellenistic art. They show the Olympic gods in battle with the giants, which they called Titans. The altar was eventually rediscovered by a self-taught amateur German archaeologist named Karl Humann in 1879. Humann wasn't in the area principally to dig for ruins. He was living there because he was in bad health and the weather was supposed to be better there than it is in Germany. He finally got a job and was there to build a road. Excavation of this largest known altar of the ancient world took 2 years, with the initial campaign coming to an end in 1880. German authorities are quick to point out that they had permission from the local Ottoman authorities not only to dig, but to remove. The Germans uncovered 132 panels and another 2,100 pieces of marble. They gathered the bits and pieces, boxed them up, and shipped them off to Berlin. The altar is a matter of considerable controversy. There is still a town near this original site called Pergamon. Buses that pass through the area carrying tourists see signs saying in Turkish, "Give us back our altar." The hit on the Germans is partly fair but mostly unjust. It's true enough that to this day they refuse to return or even discuss the concept of reparations. German artists, conservators, and restorers rebuilt the altar, which you see here. Interestingly, in an age before what we would even think to call protection of cultural treasures, the motto in the late 1800s seems to be mostly finders keepers, losers weepers, they made replicas, shipped them back to Pergamon, and reassembled them on site. The carping here is that the Turks believe the original should have been brought to Pergamon and the copies kept in Berlin. I think the idea of an identical copy, which should be much easier to make now than it was 100 years ago, is a really good one, and one that should be replicated all over. There are bits and pieces of classical antiquity ripped up from their foundations and scattered all over Western Europe and even in the United States. The only question is, who gets the original, who gets the copy, and one final question, who has to pay for it? I suspect the squabbling will go on long after I've gone to my grave. The gate was probably constructed during the reign of Emperor Hadrian from about 120 to 130 AD. At the time, it was an entryway to a huge market area of the city of Miletus. The gate today is a large marble monument, about 30 meters wide, 16 meters tall, and 5 meters deep. The two-story structure has 3 doorways, which you can see in this photograph, as well as a number of projections and niches. The dimensions show you why it required a separate building to display properly. The gate underwent complete restoration in the 3rd century AD following major damage from an earthquake. In the 6th century AD, Byzantine Emperor Justinian ordered the defenses of Miletus to be strengthened. He incorporated the sturdy gate into the city walls. In the 10th or 11th century, the date is uncertain, an earthquake rattled and finally caused the gate to collapse completely. Fragments of the structure were scavenged and used in surrounding buildings, but the majority of it just sunk into the ground. German archaeologists were working in the remains of the city in the early 1900s and discovered and then excavated these remains and shipped them off to Berlin. The lead archaeologist, Theodor Weigand, gave a presentation using models to Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was so impressed that he ordered the gate's reconstruction at full scale, like a theater backdrop, in the Pergamonmuseum. Only fragments had survived, however, and reconstruction involved addition of significant new material. In the 1920s and 1930s, the museum was criticized for portraying the monuments as originals when, in fact, they consisted significantly of non-original material. The gate was damaged during World War II, was restored in the 1950s, and has been further restored early in the 21st century. The Ishtar gate into the city of Babylon comes complete with controversy as to how it was acquired and what should happen to it today. The Iraqi government apparently would like it back, although there is some question as to how safe the artifact would be if it were sent home. Unfortunately, we have excellent recent experience in how a hostile government might treat antique buildings and statues if it imagines the antiques somehow contradict their religious beliefs. The Taliban's deliberate destruction of non-Islamic art in Afghanistan may argue in favor of keeping the gateway in Berlin, where it might be safe from destruction. On the other hand, that could be a self-serving statement posited by the thieves who want to keep their lucre inside of Berlin. The gate was built about 575 BC by order of King Nebuchadnezzar on the north side of the city, and was named after a Mesopotamian goddess of love and war. It was one of 8 gateways that provided entry into the inner city. It only opened up one time a year for a New Year's procession. It was decorated with blue bricks that showed alternating rows of bulls and dragons. It was part of a grand walled processional way leading into the center of the city. The monumental gateway was meant to impress the ruled the visitors, and also to frighten off any potential aggressors. It is impressive. The Ishtar Gate did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of the Babylon city walls and gave an opening into what's called the Processional Way, a part of which you can see depicted here. If the gates were partly defensive, the walkway was clearly designed to show anyone entering just how small, insignificant, and puny they might be compared with the local king. The walkway was actually half a mile long and up to 66 feet wide. The curators at the Pergamon are no fools and really didn't relish shutting down the museum for years, especially since they had only so very recently been able to access the artifacts at all. Unfortunately, the museum truly does need repairs, and they are shutting it down in sections. The work began in 2018 and is supposed to wrap up in 2025. Because of the pandemic, I doubt they'll make that deadline, but fortunately, they've created a temporary structure across the river from the Bode Museum to house some of the artifacts and an enormous panorama to show what the city of Pergamon, after which the museum was named, might have looked like in 129 AD. This is an entirely separate building. I haven't been able to learn how they plan to use it after the repairs on the main building are complete, but given the size and complexity of the exhibit, there is a huge diorama showing what the city looked like in its heyday, which appears to give a real feeling, I think, for what it must have been like to be there. I imagine it will remain. Perhaps in a few hundred years, archaeologists will scoff at this recreation, much as they do at the Palace of Knossos. But for now, I think it's going to be worth the effort to see. You'll recall that the Bode Museum was purpose-built to house some of the archaeological treasures being shipped back to Berlin from all over the Middle East, although it eventually proved to be too small for the task. Today, the museum houses the Byzantine art collection. It was authorized by Kaiser Wilhelm II and went up at the end of the museum building spree. And in addition to the art, and I am looking forward to seeing the Byzantine collection that is housed here today, is also what one blogger called the most beautiful museum cafe in Berlin. There's also a music venue. I thought I might go in for a cocktail and concert. According to the schedule, concerts generally start at 4 or 5 o'clock. However, I am more likely to go in for coffee and cake. And with that, allow me to introduce you to the last statue I expect to see on the island. It's a sculpture called Head of Hecktor. I have no idea what the artist was attempting to convey with this one, which resembles a little bit the tumble-down statues of the giants in Agrigento in Sicily, except it's not very attractive. I learned by studying German that what we Americans think of as a coffee break comes in two distinctive flavors, at least in the German language. The simpler could be called Ein Pause. The word just means a break. As far as I can tell, there's no regular time or requirement for what you might eat or drink, or even if you do eat or drink something. The more delightful German dining possibility is Kaffee und Kuchen. In the afternoon, every reasonable restaurant, cafe, and pastry shop will have time for this. I think it might be analogous to a British afternoon tea, since it's generally available between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, sometimes a little earlier. Coffee and a variety of cakes feature prominently. I suspect one slice of Black Forest cherry chocolate cake here has more calories than I normally eat in an entire day. Perhaps I'll be able to limit my sin by buying a cupcake. On the other hand, maybe I won't bother. Thank you for joining me today on a walk around the museum island. Come back next time for another visit here on the Armchair Traveler.